The sun had only just begun to lift itself over the distant line of hills, painting the morning in pale amber, when Clara adjusted the strap of her rifle bag and walked across the gravel toward the long-range shooting line. She had never really planned on being here so early. It was supposed to be just a casual Saturday, a day to swap out some of the cardboard targets for the newer steel plates, to enjoy the crisp air and the mechanical satisfaction of setting up clean shooting lanes for the next round of enthusiasts. Yet something in the morning felt different, like the air carried not just the scent of dew and dry grass but also the promise of something significant waiting for her. She set down the bag, knelt to tighten one of the metal brackets, and listened to the echo of her own movements in the open range, the kind of place where silence itself seemed alive. Clara wasn't new to this. She had been around rifles since she was a teenager, her father insisting that discipline and precision were as much about character as they were about shooting. Over the years, she had grown into the calm, exacting rhythm of long-range marksmanship, though she never bragged about it. Her friends thought of her as quiet, reserved, the sort of person who spoke in action rather than words. Today, she thought, was just about maintenance, about clearing her mind after a hectic week of deadlines, and maybe firing a few shots just for practice. But as she swapped the last target and stood back to look at the neat line of bullseyes stretching into the shimmering distance, she felt a restlessness. It wasn't about competition, it wasn't about proving herself, it was about testing the invisible thread that connected her eye, her hand, the rifle, and a point so far away it almost dissolved into mirage. She carried her rifle with deliberate care, laying it across the bench and running her fingers along the cool metal as though greeting an old friend. The weapon was heavy, not just in weight but in history, having been customized piece by piece through years of adjustment. The stock had been sanded smooth by her own hands, the scope was one she had saved months for, and the trigger had been tuned to the precise pressure she favored. She loaded a single round, not because she was in a hurry but because one was enough. One to test her patience, one to measure her steadiness, one to see whether everything she had learned and internalized over years of practice could converge in a single instant. The range stretched a mile, and though she had hit long-distance targets before, the mile marker was something she had always considered out of reach for casual shooting, the kind of achievement left for competitions or military demonstrations. Still, today she felt the urge to try. She adjusted the scope, her eyes narrowing as she accounted for the morning breeze that curled gently from the west. She checked the chart she had scribbled into her notebook last month, a meticulous record of bullet drop and wind drift, though she knew that at this distance theory could only take her halfway. Intuition had to do the rest. Her breath slowed, her pulse steadied, and for a moment the world around her seemed to narrow until all that existed was the rifle, her heartbeat, and the distant circle of black at the center of the target. She remembered what her father had always told her, that long-range shooting wasn't about pulling the trigger but about letting the shot happen, surrendering to the connection between body and mind so completely that it became effortless. Clara exhaled, long and controlled, letting the last thread of air slip past her lips. The trigger felt weightless beneath her finger, and in that stillness she squeezed. The shot cracked, startling in the silence, the recoil pressing into her shoulder, and then the long wait began, a wait measured not in seconds but in heartbeats. She kept her eye against the scope, watching the vapor trail arc invisibly across the mile of open air, the bullet cutting its path through unseen currents, the geometry of physics playing out beyond her perception. Then came the distant ping, faint yet unmistakable, a sound that leapt across the distance with the clarity of a bell. She blinked, almost not believing, then adjusted the scope slightly to confirm. The bullet had struck the bullseye, dead center, a single perfect shot. For a moment she sat frozen, the echo of the achievement settling into her bones. She hadn't come here to prove anything, hadn't come expecting to attempt such a feat, and yet there it was, a mile away, the tiny black center pierced by the force of her focus and patience. She felt a smile creep across her face, rare and quiet, not the grin of pride but the subtle recognition that sometimes life handed you moments you couldn't have planned, moments where everything aligned without warning. She leaned back, her hands resting lightly on the bench, and let the silence return around her. The hills glowed brighter under the rising sun, the dew on the grass catching light like scattered diamonds, and she thought of how strange it was that such a vast distance could collapse into a single instant of connection. The range suddenly felt like more than a stretch of gravel and targets. It felt like a place where time itself could bend, where focus could shape reality. Clara packed away the rifle slowly, savoring the ritual, her movements unhurried, as though prolonging the intimacy of what had just occurred. She knew no one else had witnessed it, no crowd had cheered, no official had marked it down, but that only made it purer. This wasn't about recognition. It was about knowing that once, on a quiet morning, while simply swapping targets, She had looked across a mile of earth and sky and struck true. And that knowledge, she thought, would stay with her longer than any applause ever could. She slung the bag over her shoulder and took one last look down the range before walking back toward her truck, her footsteps crunching in rhythm with her calm satisfaction, carrying her away from the moment but not away from its memory. Clara sat behind the wheel of her truck for a long while before starting the engine, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, the sound of that single distant ping still alive in her memory. She could have driven straight home, brewed some coffee, and filed the morning away as one of those perfect private victories, but something about the experience made her restless in a different way. She wasn't tired, she wasn't even relieved. Instead she felt charged, like her body had been wound into a spring. She thought about the target still standing a mile away, the single hole at its center a mark of improbable accuracy, and wondered if leaving it there, unacknowledged, might make it vanish like a dream. With that thought pressing at her, she decided to circle back. She climbed out of the truck, boots crunching gravel again, and began the long walk downrange, past the neat intervals of closer targets she had set earlier, past the 100-yard marks, the 500-yard steel plates, the 800-yard gong with its dull gray face scarred from countless rounds. The mile marker loomed far off, the morning air heating up and making the distant shape blur and shimmer like a mirage, but she kept walking, step after deliberate step. It was rare for her to walk this far. Usually she drove the cart when resetting, but this time the walk felt necessary, like a pilgrimage to confirm what had really happened. The closer she got, the more surreal it seemed, the knowledge that a bullet, small and fast, had crossed all this space to meet a point barely larger than the palm of her hand. When she finally reached the target stand, the sun was high enough to warm the steel and her own skin. She reached out and touched the bullseye, her fingertips brushing the tiny crater left by the round. It was real. Solid. Proof that the moment hadn't been imagination. She felt the same quiet thrill she had at the bench, but here it was deeper, anchored by the sight of her own work. She stood there for a long time, not caring about the sweat on her brow or the ache in her calves from the walk. Then, slowly, she sat in the grass beside the stand, leaning back on her elbows, staring across the immense stretch of earth she had just walked. From here the shooting bench looked impossibly far, a tiny speck under the glow of the hills, and she laughed softly at the absurdity of connecting two worlds so far apart with nothing but a single bullet. She thought of her father again, how he used to say distance wasn't about miles or meters but about focus, about whether you were willing to narrow everything in your mind until there was only one path, one line, one point of arrival. She closed her eyes and listened to the breeze brushing through the dry grass, felt the earth solid beneath her, and for a moment she wasn't just a shooter on a range, she was a traveler, a witness to the strange ways precision and patience could collapse the vastness of space. She lay there until a shadow crossed over her face, and when she opened her eyes she saw a hawk circling high above, gliding on invisible currents as effortlessly as she had once dreamed of doing. The hawk tilted its wings and wheeled away, and Clara felt a kinship with it, both of them moving across space with nothing but focus and instinct to guide them. When she finally stood, brushing dust and grass from her jeans, she realized she couldn't simply leave the target standing here without marking the moment. She reached into her bag and pulled out a permanent marker she kept for range notes. Carefully, she wrote the date and the time on the back of the target stand, a small signature of remembrance, not for anyone else but for herself. Then she turned and began the long walk back, this time with a lighter step, as if each stride carried the echo of that distant ping. At the bench again, she poured water from her flask, the liquid cold and refreshing as it slid down her throat. She felt no desire to fire another shot that morning. Somehow it seemed unnecessary, even wrong, as though repeating the act would dull the purity of what had already been achieved. She packed up her rifle once more, sealing it carefully in its bag, and this time when she climbed into her truck she started the engine without hesitation. The road back home wound through open fields and sparse trees, sunlight filtering through the leaves in shifting patterns, and she found herself driving slower than usual, letting the quiet countryside fill her vision. Each bend of the road felt like a continuation of that shot, a line extending not just across space but into time, stretching her morning into something larger than itself. As the truck hummed along, she wondered whether to tell anyone about what had happened. Her friends would be impressed, no doubt. Her father would probably nod and say he knew she had it in her all along. But she hesitated, knowing that once the story left her lips it might become something else, something subject to other people's disbelief or exaggeration. Maybe it was better to keep it hers, untouched, preserved in the silence where it had been born. She pulled into her driveway just as the sun reached its late morning brilliance, the house standing quietly among the trees. She carried her gear inside, set the rifle carefully in its case, and stood by the window with a cup of coffee in hand, staring out at the woods that framed her property. The bullseye still burned in her mind, the feeling of the trigger breaking clean, the sound of the distant steel. It was so sharp, so vivid it might never leave her. She smiled again, softly, almost imperceptibly, and thought, sometimes life gives you one perfect moment, and the trick is not to demand another but to hold on to the one you were lucky enough to have. The following day Clara woke earlier than usual, stirred not by obligation but by the strange persistence of memory, as though her body itself remembered the rhythm of her breath and the feel of the trigger. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling for a while, trying to push away the thought that she was somehow obligated to return to the range, but the idea clung to her like the faint smell of gunpowder that had lingered on her hands even after washing. She made coffee, sat at her kitchen table, and opened her notebook, the one filled with scrawled notes on wind speeds, distances, adjustments, and diagrams of scope reticles. She flipped to a blank page, uncapped her pen, and without thinking began writing the words, 1 mile across the top. Below that she started sketching out the conditions of the previous morning, the temperature, the direction of the breeze, the exact time of the shot, even the mood she had been in. It seemed ridiculous, almost obsessive, but she couldn't help it. Some part of her wanted to preserve not just the act but the precise circumstances that had allowed it to happen. She paused, pen hovering, and thought about what that meant. Was she trying to replicate the moment, to prove it hadn't been a fluke? Or was she simply trying to honor it by documenting everything she could remember? She sipped her coffee, staring at the ink, and felt the tension between those two possibilities. The temptation to test herself again was strong, stronger than she wanted to admit. The shot had been perfect, a rarity, and the danger of chasing perfection was that it could consume you, turning one beautiful accident into an endless pursuit. She had seen it before in competitions, shooters who couldn't let go of their one great success, who drove themselves into frustration trying to recreate it. She didn't want that. But she also knew she couldn't ignore the pull. By mid-morning she was back in her truck, rifle bag in the seat beside her, the tires humming over the familiar road. This time she felt a trace of guilt, as though she were breaking some unspoken promise to herself to let the moment remain untouched. Yet the excitement outweighed the guilt, and she told herself it was harmless. Just another morning at the range, just practice, nothing more. When she arrived, the air was different from yesterday, heavier, the sky covered in thin gray clouds that diffused the sun into a pale sheet of light. She set up slowly, methodically, checking each adjustment on the rifle, aligning the bench, measuring the wind with a small handheld meter. Everything was done with greater care than usual, as though she were trying to leave nothing to chance. She loaded a single round again, chambering it with the same deliberate gentleness as before. Through the scope the mile target shimmered faintly, harder to make out in the muted light. She adjusted the magnification, steadied her breathing, and tried to enter that same quiet space she had found yesterday. But something was different. Her mind wasn't calm. Wasn't empty, it was buzzing with expectation, with pressure. She exhaled, pulled the trigger, and the crack rang out. She stayed on the scope, waiting for the result, but this time the sound that returned across the distance wasn't the clean, bell-like ping of steel struck true. It was silence. Then, after several heartbeats, the faint thud of dirt beyond the target. She had missed. Clara sat back, lips pressed together, feeling the sharp sting of disappointment. It shouldn't have mattered, it was only practice, but the miss cut deeper than she expected. Not because of failure itself but because it threatened the purity of yesterday's memory. She closed her eyes, reminding herself of her own rule, that she didn't need to chase perfection. Yet even as she tried to let it go, she was already chambering another round. The second shot went wide again, off by several feet. The third hit closer, clipping the edge of the target stand but not the plate itself. Her frustration grew, her movements sharper, her breathing less controlled. She forced herself to stop after the fourth miss, pulling back from the bench with a long exhale. She knew better than this, knew that once frustration crept in, precision was lost. She leaned on the bench, staring downrange, and felt the heavy truth. Yesterday had been one of those rare, singular alignments of body, mind, and circumstance, and perhaps it was never meant to be repeated. For a while she simply sat there, listening to the wind, until the weight of the rifle across her lap felt more like an anchor than a companion. She packed up earlier than she intended, driving home under the low clouds with a knot in her chest. Back at the house she left the gear by the door and went straight to the back porch, sitting in the old rocking chair that faced the trees. She tried to think about something else, anything else, the work waiting for her next week, the errands she hadn't yet done, but her mind circled back to the shots. To the perfection of yesterday, the frustration of today. She wondered if her father had ever struggled with this, the cycle of triumph and disappointment, the endless dance between skill and chance. She remembered the way he used to talk about humility, about respecting the shot whether it landed or not. Maybe that was what she had to learn now, to respect the miss as much as the hit. She rocked gently in the chair, listening to the woods, and for the first time since yesterday she allowed herself to laugh softly at her own stubbornness. The bullseye at a mile had not been diminished by today's failures. If anything, it had been elevated because now she understood how fragile, how improbable, how precious it really was. She stood after a while, stretched, and went inside to write again in her notebook. This time she didn't write about conditions or numbers. She wrote instead about acceptance, about how not every shot needed to be perfect, how sometimes the meaning of a moment lay in its uniqueness. She closed the notebook gently, placed it back on the shelf, and decided to let the rifle rest for a few days. She would return to the range again, of course. Shooting was part of her life, a rhythm as natural as breathing. But for now she wanted to hold on to the memory of that single, perfect shot without clouding it further. She poured herself another cup of coffee, stood by the window as rain began to tap against the glass, and told herself quietly, almost like a vow, one perfect moment is enough. The rain that had begun as a gentle tapping against Clara's window grew into a steady rhythm through the night, filling the forest outside her home with the sound of water slipping through branches and pooling in the soil. She didn't mind the rain, it always made her feel grounded, as though the earth itself was pausing to breathe. By the next morning the clouds had broken apart, leaving the air washed clean and heavy with the scent of damp pine. Clara woke slowly, reluctant to shake off the calm of the rain-soaked dawn, but the weight of the previous days lingered at the edges of her thoughts. The perfect shot, the misses, the quiet vow she had made to herself about letting the moment stand as it was, all of it formed a kind of echo that followed her into each small routine. She brewed coffee, toasted bread, and sat again at her table, the notebook still resting on the shelf behind her. She resisted opening it. Instead, she stared out the window at the mist lifting from the trees, watching as shafts of sunlight pierced through the canopy like golden spears. She thought of how distance worked, not just on a range but in life. How certain moments could stretch away until they seemed unreachable, and yet the memory of them remained sharp, as though they had just occurred. She realized she didn't want to chase the mile anymore, not because she couldn't, but because chasing it would only turn something extraordinary into something ordinary. Yet at the same time she felt an urge growing inside her that wasn't about the bullseye itself but about understanding the quiet power she had touched when she made that shot. It wasn't the steel plate or the rifle or the conditions that mattered. It was the stillness, the perfect alignment of her mind and body. And she wondered if she could find that feeling again in other ways, not by stretching for distance but by narrowing her focus closer, sharper, deeper. Later that morning she took the rifle out, but not to the range. Instead, she carried it into the woods behind her home, where trails wound through thickets and streams, places her father had once taken her when he taught her about hunting. She hadn't hunted in years, preferring the discipline of targets to the finality of game, but walking those trails with the weight of the rifle across her shoulder felt like returning to a chapter she had left unfinished. The forest was alive with birdsong and the drip of rainwater falling from leaves, and she moved slowly, her boots sinking slightly into the softened earth. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, only listening, only practicing awareness. Her father used to tell her that awareness was the truest skill of all, that a shooter who couldn't hear the forest breathe would never truly understand distance. She paused often, kneeling to study the ground, watching the way droplets collected on spiderwebs, the way tiny rivulets of water carved channels through the mud. Each detail felt magnified, important, as though the world itself were reminding her how to pay attention. After an hour of wandering she reached a clearing where a fallen log stretched across a narrow stream. She sat on the log, laying the rifle beside her, and closed her eyes. The silence here was different from the range. It wasn't empty but full, layered with the murmur of insects, the soft rush of water, the rustle of unseen creatures moving through the underbrush. She breathed deeply, letting that fullness sink into her, and realized this was the same stillness she had touched when she pulled the trigger at the mile. It wasn't about the shot. It was about being so present, so complete, that the moment itself became effortless. She smiled faintly, opening her eyes to the soft shimmer of sunlight on wet leaves. Sitting there she felt no need to fire the rifle. It was enough just to be here, aware, alive, connected. She spent the rest of the day in the forest, walking until the sun tilted toward evening, and when she finally returned home she felt lighter, as though the knot in her chest had loosened. That night she wrote again in her notebook, but not about distances or misses or even the bullseye. She wrote about the clearing, the stream, the log, the silence. She wrote about presence and how she wanted to learn to carry it with her, not just in shooting but in every part of her life. Over the next week Clara returned to the forest each day, sometimes with her rifle, sometimes without. She practiced not just shooting at closer distances but listening, noticing, slowing herself down. She began to see how her obsession with the mile had narrowed her vision, had made her forget the value of the process itself. Each time she returned from the woods she felt stronger, steadier, as though something inside her was aligning again. One evening, sitting on her porch as the sun dipped low, she thought back to that first perfect shot and felt no hunger to repeat it. Instead, she felt gratitude that it had happened at all, that she had been given that glimpse of something extraordinary. She realized now that the real challenge wasn't hitting the bullseye across a mile of air. The real challenge was carrying the calm and clarity that had allowed it into every other distance, every other part of her life. And with that thought, she leaned back in her chair, listening to the evening chorus of crickets, and felt a peace she hadn't known she was searching for. Days slipped into a rhythm Clara hadn't expected, a balance between the quiet of the woods and the discipline of the range, and though she told herself she wasn't chasing another perfect shot, she knew deep down that her relationship with distance had changed. She no longer thought of it as an enemy to conquer or a number to prove, but rather as a teacher, one that revealed its lessons only to those who were willing to listen. Every morning she brewed her coffee, shouldered her rifle, and chose her direction, sometimes toward the forest trails, sometimes back to the gravel lanes of the range, and sometimes simply into the silence of her own porch where she would sit for hours, writing, reflecting, or watching the shifting light through the trees. She began to notice how her perception of time had slowed. Days felt longer, fuller, because she was paying attention in ways she hadn't before. And yet, despite her vow not to chase it, the memory of the mile lingered like a star at the edge of her vision, never fully gone, never fully ignored. It was inevitable, perhaps, that someone else would learn of it. One late afternoon, as she was packing her gear at the range, she heard the crunch of tires on gravel and looked up to see an old friend stepping out of a dusty pickup. Marcus had been a fellow competitor years ago, a sharp-eyed, quick-witted shooter with a grin that carried both warmth and challenge. They hadn't seen each other in months, maybe longer, but he greeted her like no time had passed. "Heard a rumor," he said, leaning against the door of his truck. "Something about you punching steel at a mile." Dead center. Clara froze for a moment, caught off guard. She hadn't told anyone. The only mark of that morning was the date she had written on the back of the target stand, hidden from sight. She narrowed her eyes slightly. "Where'd you hear that?" Marcus shrugged. "Guy from the club said he saw the target. Said your handwriting was on it." Word spreads fast. Clara felt a flicker of irritation, not at Marcus but at the thought of her private moment slipping into public story. She didn't like the idea of people gossiping about it, turning it into something it wasn't. Still, she managed a calm smile. "Yeah, it happened." Marcus's grin widened. "That's damn impressive, Clara. Not many can claim that." She didn't reply right away. Part of her wanted to dismiss it, to wave it off as chance, but another part knew that would be dishonest. It had happened. It was real. And denying it wouldn't protect the purity of the moment, it would only diminish her honesty. So she nodded. "One shot. One hit. That's all." Marcus studied her, his grin softening into something more thoughtful. "And you don't look too thrilled about it." Clara sighed, leaning against the bench. "Because it wasn't meant to be a story. It was just a morning. One of those rare mornings where everything aligns. I didn't want it to turn into some legend people chase." Marcus tilted his head. "But that's the thing. Moments like that inspire. You might not care to brag, but someone else might see it and realize what's possible. That's not nothing." She didn't answer, though his words stayed with her long after he left. That night, back at home, she sat with her notebook open and thought about what Marcus had said. Was she selfish to want to keep the moment to herself? Or was it wiser to guard it, to let it remain untouched? She wrote until her hand cramped, sketching not just words but lines and diagrams, trying to capture the way memory itself felt fragile under the weight of retelling. She thought of her father again, and how he had always said that skill wasn't about recognition but about discipline. "Shoot for yourself," he had told her once. Never for the crowd. And she believed that still. Yet, at the same time, she began to wonder whether sharing her story, not for glory but for truth, might offer something valuable to others. A week later, when Marcus invited her to a small gathering of shooters at the range, Clara hesitated before agreeing. She didn't like crowds, didn't like the chatter of half-truths and boasts, but she felt a tug toward connection, toward seeing what others might find in the story she had been holding close. When she arrived, the group was smaller than she feared, just a handful of familiar faces, people she had once competed alongside. They welcomed her warmly with smiles and easy conversation, and for a while she simply listened, sipping coffee from a paper cup, content to fade into the background. But then Marcus, with his inevitable grin, said aloud what everyone was waiting for, "Tell them, Clara, about the mile." All eyes turned to her. For a moment she considered deflecting, but then she saw their expressions, not hungry for spectacle but curious, hopeful. So she told them. Simply, without flourish, without exaggeration. She described the morning, the silence, the single shot, the distant ping. She admitted it was luck as much as skill, that she hadn't set out to prove anything. She told them it was just one of those rare alignments that sometimes happen when you least expect it. When she finished, there was no cheer, no explosion of applause, only a quiet nodding of heads, a shared understanding. One of the younger shooters, a girl barely 20, spoke softly, "That's beautiful. Makes me want to try harder." And in that moment Clara understood what Marcus had meant. It wasn't about legend or gossip. It was about offering others the possibility of their own alignment, their own moment of silence and focus. Driving home later that night, she felt lighter. The story no longer belonged just to her, but sharing it hadn't broken its purity. Instead, it had deepened it, woven it into something larger. She realized she didn't need to fear the telling. What mattered was the way it was told, honest, humble, without the hunger for validation. She parked in her driveway, sat for a long while with the engine off, and let the night wrap around her. The stars overhead were sharp and clear, and she thought of how distance always seemed impossible until it was crossed. The mile had been hers once. Now, perhaps, it belonged to others too. The days after that small gathering at the range carried a different kind of energy for Clara, as though something invisible had shifted in the air around her. She found herself thinking not only of her own practice but of the younger shooters she had seen listening so intently, their faces bright with quiet admiration, their questions tumbling over each other as they asked about wind drift, scope adjustments, and breath control. For years Clara had kept her world small, private, content to live between the solitude of her woods and the quiet lanes of the range, but now she felt as if the circle had widened. It wasn't about fame, she would never want that, but about connection, about being part of something larger than her own stillness. She returned to the range one afternoon and found the same young woman from the gathering practicing at the 400-yard target. The girl's hands shook slightly as she worked the bolt, her concentration broken each time by her own frustration. Clara stood for a while, watching quietly before finally stepping closer. "Mind if I sit?" she asked. The girl looked up, startled, then nodded quickly. Clara sat beside her, not offering instruction at first, only watching. After the next miss she said gently, "You're breathing too fast. You're holding your air like it's a weight. Try letting it go instead. The shot should ride the breath, not fight it." The girl listened, tried again, and though the round still missed, the rhythm was calmer. Clara felt a small flicker of warmth in her chest, the satisfaction of passing down something that wasn't just mechanical but human, something she had learned in silence and could now give voice to. Over the next hour she stayed with the girl, answering questions, adjusting her stance, showing her how to read the wind in the trembling of nearby grass rather than just trusting the meter. By the time the sun tilted low, the girl had clipped the edge of the 400-yard plate, her eyes shining with triumph. Clara smiled quietly. "That's enough for today. Leave while it still feels good." The girl grinned, nodded, and packed up. Clara lingered long after, watching the sun drop behind the hills, feeling the strange satisfaction of teaching. She hadn't expected it, hadn't wanted it, but now that it had come she saw how natural it felt. In the following weeks, more young shooters sought her out, quietly at first, then more openly. They wanted advice, they wanted to hear the story of the mile, but more than that, they wanted the steadiness she carried with her, the calm way she moved and spoke. Clara resisted at first, uncomfortable with the attention, but gradually she allowed herself to share what she knew, not as a performance but as guidance. She told them the mile wasn't something you chased. "You don't reach for it," she said one evening, sitting on the bench with 3 of them listening. "It comes to you when you're ready. Focus on the breath, the trigger, the silence. Focus on what's right in front of you. Distance is only an illusion." Her words seemed to settle into them, and Clara realized she was repeating the lessons her father had once given her, reshaped by her own experience. It felt strange, almost like carrying his voice forward, though he was long gone. At home, she began writing more intentionally in her notebook, not just for herself but as though she were leaving a record for others. Notes on technique, yes, but also reflections on patience, humility, the danger of obsession. She wrote about the forest, about the hawk she had seen, about the rain, about how all of it was part of shooting because all of it was part of focus. Each page felt less like a diary and more like a message in a bottle, something she might one day hand to someone who needed it. One evening Marcus stopped by her house, unannounced, leaning against the porch railing with his familiar grin. "You're becoming a teacher," he said, half teasing, half admiring. Clara shook her head. "I'm just sharing what I know." Marcus laughed. "That's what teaching is." He paused, then grew more serious. "They need someone like you. Someone who's not chasing trophies or headlines. Someone who understands that the shot isn't about ego." Clara looked away, uncomfortable with his praise, but she couldn't deny the truth in it. She had never imagined herself as a guide, had always seen her practice as solitary, but now the solitude felt less important than the possibility of helping others find their own silence. Later that night, lying in bed, she thought again of the mile. It no longer felt like hers alone, not because others had touched it but because she had allowed its meaning to expand. It wasn't about the steel plate at the end of the range anymore. It was about what it had taught her and what it could teach others. She realized with quiet certainty that the shot itself would fade in memory, but the lessons would remain. The following weekend she organized a small practice session, not formal, just an open invitation to anyone who wanted to come. A handful arrived, carrying their rifles nervously, unsure what to expect. Clara began not with shooting but with silence. She asked them all to sit on the benches, rifles down, and simply breathe. At first they looked confused, restless, but gradually the tension eased. She spoke softly about listening to the wind, watching the light, feeling the ground under their boots. Only after that did she let them fire. And though none of them hit their distant targets, the air was different, calmer, more focused, less frantic. By the end of the day, one of the young men approached her and said, "I've never felt this kind of peace before." "Thank you." Clara smiled, touched by the sincerity, and realized this was the true gift of the mile. Not the shot itself but the stillness it had revealed. Driving home, she felt a quiet resolve building inside her. She didn't know where this path would lead, whether she would become a mentor, a teacher, or simply a friend to those seeking guidance. But she knew one thing for certain: she could no longer pretend the mile had been just hers. It had opened a door, and through it she was stepping into something larger than herself, something that connected her not just to distance but to people, to time, to the quiet truth that precision was only half the story. The other half was presence. And for the first time in a long time, Clara felt ready to embrace it fully. Word spread quietly but steadily, not through announcements or flashy stories, but through the quiet chain of people who had trained with Clara and gone home carrying a new kind of calm in their movements. She never intended to build a reputation, never sought it, yet within a few months the range that had always been half empty during weekday mornings began to hum with quiet gatherings of shooters who wanted not just to test their rifles but to test themselves against the silence she spoke of. Clara noticed the difference immediately: fewer shouts of frustration, fewer boastful claims, and more moments of stillness, shooters sitting with their eyes closed between rounds, listening to the wind or feeling the ground before lifting their rifles again. It surprised her, humbled her, but also filled her with a sense of responsibility she hadn't known she was capable of carrying. One morning Marcus arrived again, this time with a stranger, a middle-aged man with deep-set eyes and a posture that carried both discipline and fatigue. Marcus introduced him simply as Daniel, a former marksman who had left competitive shooting years ago after a personal loss he didn't explain. Daniel shook Clara's hand firmly, and though he said little at first, she noticed the way his gaze lingered on the mile marker downrange, the way his jaw tightened slightly as if old memories had surfaced. She didn't press him. Instead, she welcomed him into the quiet rhythm of their practice, showing him the exercises she gave to the younger shooters. At first he was skeptical, his movements crisp but impatient, the kind of precision born from years of training yet sharpened into rigidity. But over the next several sessions, Clara saw the edges of his posture soften. He began to breathe slower, to listen more, to allow silence rather than fight against it. One afternoon, after hitting the 600-yard plate cleanly, he lowered his rifle and looked at her with a quiet intensity. "I haven't felt this peace in years," he admitted. She nodded, understanding without needing to ask. From then on, Daniel became a regular, and the circle of shooters grew more diverse. Young and old, men and women, veterans of competition and complete beginners. Clara never tried to formalize it, never called herself a teacher, but the truth was undeniable: she was leading something. It became common for her to arrive at the range and find people already waiting, eager to ask questions or simply to share in the calm. She found herself speaking more, but always carefully, aware of how easily words could become rules instead of guidance. Every shot is a mirror, she told them one evening as the sun burned orange against the hills. If you rush, it will show your rush. If you doubt, it will show your doubt. The steel doesn't lie, but it doesn't judge either. It only reflects what you bring to it. They listened, and Clara felt the weight of her father's lessons echoing through her own voice. Yet with each passing week she also felt the quiet pressure building. The mile had been the seed of all this, and though she hadn't spoken of it much since the first gathering, it lingered in people's minds. More than once she caught the younger shooters glancing toward the distant target, whispering among themselves about trying it someday. Part of her worried that the mile would become a distraction, a symbol that pulled them away from the lessons of patience and presence. One evening, when the range was nearly empty, Daniel approached her with the question she had been dreading. "Why don't you try it again?" he asked gently. "Not to prove anything. Not for the crowd. Just to see." Clara was silent for a long time, the memory of her second day misses rising sharp in her chest. Finally she shook her head. "Because if I chase it, I'll lose what it gave me." It wasn't meant to be repeated. Daniel studied her, then nodded slowly. "Maybe. But sometimes revisiting a moment isn't about chasing it. It's about sharing it." His words haunted her over the following days. She didn't speak of them to Marcus or the others, but at night she found herself lying awake, imagining the long stretch of air, the distant circle of steel, the silence before the shot. She wondered if Daniel was right, that perhaps returning to the mile wasn't about herself at all, but about the people who had gathered around her, searching for their own stillness. The thought unsettled her because she had always believed in humility, in resisting the pull of ego. Yet when she watched the younger shooters struggle and grow, she began to consider whether one more mile might not be an act of pride but of generosity. As weeks passed, the question gnawed at her until finally, one quiet morning, she made her decision. She didn't announce it, didn't invite a crowd. She arrived at the range alone, set her rifle on the bench and stared across the distance. The air was still, the sky clear, the kind of morning that carried no promise yet offered quiet possibility. She loaded a single round, not shaking, not nervous, only present. She let her breath settle, let her thoughts drift into silence, and when the moment felt effortless she squeezed. The crack rang out, the recoil pressed into her shoulder, and the long wait began. She watched through the scope, her heartbeat steady, her focus calm. Then came the faintest ping, not sharp but certain, a sound that carried across the distance like a whisper returned. Clara closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. She hadn't missed. She hadn't destroyed the purity of the first shot. Instead, she had woven it into something larger, something shared. She didn't mark the target this time. She didn't write the date. She only packed her rifle, stood, and looked once more down the mile before turning away. That afternoon, when the others gathered, she didn't speak of it unless asked. And when Marcus, with his knowing grin, raised an eyebrow, she simply said, "It was enough." He nodded, understanding without needing more. The mile had come full circle, not as a conquest but as a gift, and Clara felt no hunger for another. What mattered now was not her own distance, but the distances others would cross, each in their own silence, each in their own time. Autumn crept into the valley slowly, washing the hills with shades of copper and gold, and Clara felt the change in the air as much as she saw it in the trees. The mornings grew sharper, the light thinner, the sound of migrating birds carrying across the range like distant bells. Life around her settled into a rhythm that was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in its routines of coffee, notebook pages, and rifle cleaning, but extraordinary in the quiet community that had gathered, in the way silence itself had become a shared practice among people who once came to the range only to chase noise and numbers. Clara no longer thought of herself as the solitary shooter who once guarded her moments like fragile treasures. She was still private, still reserved, but now she understood that some treasures grew stronger when shared. Every week she met with new faces, students, veterans, hunters, even a father who brought his teenage daughter not to compete but to learn patience. She saw in each of them the same hunger she had once carried, the same restless need to prove something, and she recognized the relief in their eyes when they discovered that what they were searching for wasn't glory but calm. The mile was rarely spoken of now. It had become a kind of quiet legend, but Clara refused to let it dominate the lessons. She reminded them instead of the nearer distances, the breath, the rhythm. "The shot is never about the steel," she told them. "It's about you. The steel just answers back." They listened, and she could see how those words sank deeper than instructions about elevation or windage. Sometimes they hit, sometimes they missed, but the misses no longer carried the same frustration. Instead, they carried curiosity, patience, even gratitude. And Clara, watching them, felt a pride that was softer than triumph but stronger than any trophy she had ever imagined. Yet even as she embraced her role, she remained humble. She still walked the woods behind her house, still sat by the stream and watched the hawks circling overhead, still wrote long entries in her notebook about silence, breath, and the unseen threads that connect moments across time. Her home became filled with pages, each covered in her handwriting, each a reflection not just of shooting but of living. Marcus teased her once, calling it a book in the making, but Clara only smiled. She wasn't writing for an audience. She was writing for continuity, for the day when her hands might no longer hold a rifle but her words might still guide someone else toward presence. Daniel, who had once arrived at the range carrying his grief like armor, grew lighter in those months. He spoke more freely, laughed more often, and one evening after a clean shot at 700 yards, he admitted that Clara's lessons had helped him forgive himself for mistakes that had nothing to do with shooting. Clara listened quietly, knowing that was the real purpose of what they were doing, not to perfect aim but to mend something deeper. And as more people came and went, carrying fragments of stillness back into their lives, Clara began to see how the ripple had spread far beyond her. It was no longer about her shot, her silence, her mile. It was about the way presence multiplied when shared, the way patience caught like fire in dry grass, spreading quietly but unstoppable. One particularly crisp morning, as frost clung to the gravel and the range lay empty in the pale dawn, Clara stood alone again at the bench with her rifle laid across it. She didn't load it. She didn't fire. She simply stood, breathing, staring across the mile. The memory of that first perfect shot returned, clear and sharp, but now it carried no hunger, no ache. It was a part of her but not the center of her. She realized then that distance wasn't measured in yards or miles at all, it was measured in growth, in the space between who she had been and who she had become. She touched the rifle gently, almost like a farewell, though she knew she would continue to shoot. But the need to prove herself, the weight of the bullseye, had lifted. She turned and walked back to her truck, the crunch of frost beneath her boots marking each step like punctuation. Later that week, when a young girl asked her if hitting the mile had been the greatest moment of her life, Clara smiled softly and shook her head. "No," she said. "The greatest moment was realizing I didn't need to hit it again." The girl looked puzzled, but Clara didn't explain further. She knew the girl would come to understand in her own time, through her own silence. That was the way of things. You couldn't hand someone presents, you could only point them toward it. And so the seasons turned, autumn giving way to winter, the range growing quieter as snow dusted the hills, and Clara remained steady at the center of it all. She no longer measured her days by shots fired or targets hit but by the stillness she carried into each moment, by the way she could feel the world breathe around her. Sometimes, when the air was sharp and the sky wide, she thought of her father and imagined him standing beside her, nodding, proud not of the mile but of the humility it had taught her. And she thought of the hawk circling above, of the stream in the woods, of the silence that had become her truest companion. The mile would always be part of her story, but it was no longer the story. The story was here, in the presence, in the patience, in the quiet gift she could offer to anyone willing to sit, breathe and listen. And as she closed her notebook one winter evening, setting it aside beside a stack of filled pages, Clara whispered to herself words that felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. The shot lives on, not in the steel but in the silence it leaves behind. The end.